Okay, so indeed, new things in 18.2, and as I mentioned, 18 things, 30 minutes. That's I try to categorize them to make it easier to keep a handle of all these many things that we're dealing with. First category, things that pertain to the ride and the ID. Then there's a bunch of user command stuff, and finally various utilities. And then subcategories in each one, things that we've added that wasn't there before, and things that were there before, but we've added significant functionality to those. Without further ado, dark themes. Morten mentioned this in his opening statement. There's the very popular Dracula theme, and there is the New Moon theme, and the Nord theme. Those are well specified and well liked, so that's why we have added those. Thank you to the designers. We have harmonized the help menus in IDE and Ride, so they now have almost the same entries. The only difference you'll spot here is that there's a GUI overview that pertains to the Windows GUI, and that doesn't really make sense in most cases where you will be using Ride, so it's not there. And on macOS, it can look slightly different, but the same entries basically. I'd especially like to draw your attention to the Getting Started entry. That's the first one there. That's a brand new page on our website that we link to there. And it has lots and lots of links to good stuff for getting you started with things. It's good to give people advice on this. Next up is user commands. If you ever try to develop or debug existing user commands, then you might have found an issue with error handling. So consider this complicated statement, and you get a value error. Helpfully, APL will tell you that it was specifically the variable C that was missing. Now, if the same thing happens, and you can even find further information about the error that happened inside QuadDMX. It's a namespace generated for every error. So that message about it being C is in there. If the same thing happens inside a user command execution, you, well, should we call it unhelpfully, don't get any details about the error that happened, just the fact that it was a value error. That's how it has been until now. But when that error happens, we clone this QuadDMX namespace with all the error information to its location inside SoldUtils. SoldUtils is the technical background upon which the user command system stands. And you can then query that, and everything is there until the next error happens inside a user command. So the information is preserved and makes it much easier to debug and figure out what went wrong. We're also taking leaps and bounds, quite literally, in the tracing of user command code. So let me give you some historical background for that. Let's say you try tracing into a user command. So historically, it's been like this. You trace into the user command processor, and you just need to trace 30 lines down. Be careful, don't trace one step too far, or you spoiled the opportunity and you have to start over. This takes you into the spice function, where you need to trace 300 lines down, and be careful, don't just lean on that enter key or you might overshoot and it's too late, you have to start over. And finally, you get this very mystical code. I don't get it, but whatever. And then you're inside the actual user command code that is what you want to trace into. Obviously, this is quite painful. So some soul with a lot of feeling for the poor developer added a hack, namely the dash. You add a dash after the user command invocation. It's kind of like a modifier, but it doesn't have a name of a modifier, so it's like out of the syntax. If you try that, you'll get an error message. You have to turn debugging on first. So you turn the debugging on, and then you try again. Just execute this, don't trace into it, or you'll go through the steps we saw before. And that gets you straight into the code you want to run. Notice the red dot here signalizes a stop bit that's been set in order to make this whole thing work, this hack. Okay, so yeah, it was a lot better, but not really very sleek either. What we've done now is you can trace into a user command invocation. You'll see a very small user command processor, 3 lines of code, execute the first line, trace into the second line, and you are inside your code, no stop bit set. That's how we like it. And with that, it'd be much easier to develop user commands. One user command, Morten mentioned as well, Apple Cart. If you don't know what the Apple Card is, you certainly should go and find out. Applecard.info, it can look something like this, and you type in something you want to know about, and you get the answer right there. Much faster than a certain other place to get this answer. It's so useful when you are writing APL code that we have bundled it with APL, the APL interpreter. You can now get the answers right inside your APL session like this, and even though the database is stored online, it will fetch it once a day for you if you use the user command the first time you use it. And there are also various options. You can open up Apple Card in a little pop-up window thanks to the cross-platform HTML renderer and Ride's built-in HTML renderer. You can choose the color scheme that you like. If you want to share a search result with one of your friends, then you can ask for the URL for that search query, and you get the answer right there instead of actually performing the query. And you can even add options like the colors that you want. And there's actually somewhat more to this user command. Check it out in the documentation. Get user command. I think this one is my favorite. So let's say traditionally you want to import some code. First thing is you create a namespace to contain this code in so it doesn't pollute your existing code. And there are a couple of different ways you can create a namespace. Then you copy in the namespace, copy in the code from an external workspace. That is, if the code is stored in a workspace, but it might not be. Maybe is some modern person using link instead. So you'd use link import, except if you want to maintain synchronization between the things that you import and what's on disk, in which case you use link create. Actually, if it's some older thing, but still in text files, you might want to use salt load, or you could just use quad fix, or was it 2 quad fix? Either way, it might be located online, in which case you have to download it. So just use HTTP command, which you have to remember to load using a salt load there. So it might be something that comes down as a zip file, and that's not built into APL, at least not yet. So you might want to shell out, or it might be you need to fetch something else from the environment outside. Or it could just be a text file, in which case you use quad nget. And if you want multiple files, don't forget to use quad ninfo. And then once you've got the text file in, you might want to use quad CSV with the right separator, because maybe it's not actually a comma separated file, but say a tab separated file. Or maybe it's quad JSON, and maybe it's XML. So either way, you have to just figure out what it is, and then you're ready to start programming. So I got tired of that, and I packed all that into the get user command. The idea is that it's pretty obvious from what I'm trying to get what it is. And so it should be able to have the computer determine how to load it into the workspace. You can see examples of this. I'll just show you a few from the documentation. So these are some of the things you can do. The idea is basically that we ask the question, can we get it? Yes, we can. That's get. Names. This was Richard Park's idea, and I love it. Let's say you copied in some utility functions from the utils workspace. Now, if you want to see what it exactly you've got, then the names user command displays it in nice alphabetical columns. So this is similar to the FNS command, system command, or the quad NL system function, but they are kind of awkward to use in that either they'll give you one tall column, or they will give you a display that goes with not so nicely formatted columns, or even just a long row of names. So this is specifically made for the developer at developing time. It adjusts to your screen width and gives you nice columns like this. And it also has a lot of bells and whistles that are really nice to know about. If you give it name classes of APL items, then it will use only those that are following these. So here we're actually doing all the name classes, and then it will also add little headers to indicate which type everything is. You can write any expression for generating these name classes. And if there are only a few names, it writes it in a nice way. Either way, you can specify subname classes and it will nicely show you that as well. You can also filter using globbing style patterns. And you can specify another namespace that you want to look into instead. And as you can see, when we use a different namespace, it gives you the full path to the name, which makes it easier to just say double click on such a name and see its definition. Have a look at the full documentation in names. Represent. It's kind of the inverse of get. So let's say you have some APL data and it could be this matrix of vectors, and you want to find an APL expression for this, and so that you can do with represent. So it finds an APL representation for this array. You could also use it with, say, a tacit function that you don't quite get the structure of, and it will fully parenthesize it for you. You can even use the new APL array notation that isn't quite implemented yet, but Morten mentioned. However, it is implemented in forms of some models, albeit limited models. We can still use it for this. So see, what does this array look like using array notation? Maybe you want to take this APL array and you want to use it in some JavaScript. So firstly, let's change the format to JS, JavaScript. And secondly, let's put it into a file so that it's ready to use right away. There we go. And notice that this is neither the compact nor the non-compact form that QuadJSON would output. It has been formatted nicely for you for convenience. Let's say we have a function, but we need to somehow have the expression that would create this function because we want to include it somewhere special or paste it to somebody else. So how to define it in one line, and we can get that invocation using QuadFX just by giving a function name. And here's another example. This is again taking a table and we want to convert it to a comma separated value. And it will give you that right away. You can use that for whatever you need. You can take a TSV instead for type separated, etc. So these are just some of the things that represent can do. Have a look at the documentation for the full details. The view user command. This has been something that Kai Jäger has been asking for a while. So thank you, Kai, for inspiring this. I think the technology originally comes from Phil Last. Thank you to him as well. Sometimes you can have a small APL statement and it makes a big result. Then you might want to flood your APL session with the result, because you see the expressions you're entering and you're kind of keeping a flow there, and having a big result in the middle would be very awkward. So the view user command allows you to take that result, instead of turning it into a result in the session, it opens up a temporary editor window, but the editor window is not tied to any particular name. So there will be no clutter of result name in your APL session. Rather, it's just a temporary window and you can keep working. It doesn't use a thread. It doesn't use any resources really. It just sits there until you close it with the result. You can even use user commands. So this user command would normally draw some lines in this array and then split them out to the session. Here we're capturing the result from the disp user command and showing them in our window instead. There are also some options for it. So you can actually set a boxing. That's something people often want. But on the other hand, also something people often don't want. The reason would be that it could be very verbose. We have a new option on the box user command, or boxing user command, where you can choose the boxing level for the view user command. So here we're turning boxing on and setting only view to max. The default of min would still apply to the normal APL session. In fact, when we then run it, then we get maximum boxing level in this window, but the boxing level in the session stays as normal. And then there's also a new value you can use, which is none. And that turns the boxing mode on, but it displays things as if they weren't boxed at all. That's for the most compact form in many cases. So here you can turn boxing on, but the style is as if it was not boxed, non-boxed in the session, and you can still have view set to, for example, max, and that allows you to use view to open a window with all the verbosity of that output and have the session be nice and clean. As you might have noticed in the previous presentation by Richard, thank you for demonstrating that, Richard, saving me some time. Then when you start a demonstration script, you get a nice message saying loaded a script from this location, and it also adds some menu items in the Windows IDE to help you navigate that demonstration script. Now, some people, they use this demonstration user command to cheat. They don't like typing while under time pressure, and so they want to pretend that they can actually type that fast. That means that their secret is given away by this message saying loaded script and by these extra menu items. So we've added a quiet option, and it will just start doing things. The HTML user command, it has been around for a little while now, but we've given it some enhancements. The problem is you might take some HTML code and just paste it in, and then because it has to take an array, which is the APL, and the APL array that specifies the HTML, you need to double any quotes because it's a literal expression here. So by adding the raw modifier, we just take everything else on that line and treat it as HTML, and then you don't need to worry about the quotes. That's convenient when you're copying things back and forth between APL and the surrounding world. And you can see that working there. You also added a heuristic. If what you give the HTML user command doesn't quite look like HTML, but rather looks very much like a URL, then we'll treat it as such, and we'll open an HTML renderer or HTML window with that address. Moving right on, the in user command is an old one by now. It was traditionally used when you were moving from one APL version to another, whether it's from a different vendor or an incompatible version from the same vendor. So it would deal with transfer files from various systems. And then you would get something that corresponds to the workspace you had in that other system, and you could save it as your workspace, and done. Now, in today's world, you might want to take that workspace from somewhere and create a directory structure of text files using link. So the way you would have to do that is probably create a namespace, move into that namespace, then transfer in from the transfer file, and then you export from this namespace to some location. And what we've done is we have added a modifier out there, and that allows you to do this whole thing in one go. Just instead of populating the current workspace, just take the transfer file and stick it into a directory. If this doesn't make any sense to you, then, and what all this thing about link is, you want to check the presentation as we begin tomorrow. And for the rest of the user command enhancement, output.find, thank you to Michael Bass for this one. If you have a function that just creates a result and it doesn't use quad gets to force that result to be shown, then it can be rather hard to track down where the output is coming from. Maybe even you've forgotten some quad gets, and you can use this for that as well. So what happens is that you run your function and mysteriously you have some number appearing in this case. Turn output.find on, and you get a message out right before any output saying where this output is coming from. Makes it a whole lot easier to track down what's going on when you have some stray output. However, if you're dealing with threads, concurrency, or some automated system that just sits and runs on its own, you might want to know when the particular output happened. In fact, if you look in the console of browsers and so on, they will often print the timestamp of when various output happens. And so add -timestamp, and off you go. You get a timestamp whenever there's some output. That's it for the utilities. Onto the utilities. The first one is a system function, quad ATX. So let's say you have the name of some APL item and you want to know some information. We could call it meta information about it. What are your options? Well, the first thing you want to do is probably look at its name class. Just remember that quad NC returns a one element vector if you give it a single name. So you might want to take the first element of that. Actually, forget that. You might want to ravel it and enclose it because then you get more information. Also, the subclass of it. Say instead of saying it's a function, you can say it's specifically a threadfun or defun or a tacit function. Then you might want to know what are the particular syntax attributes or other attributes, say who has created this function. And you might want to dig in the particular, actually dig really far in to get the piece of information that you want. Except for the size, that's not in the attributes. You have to get that separately. And then you want to know what code it consists of. That is, if it's a function. If it's an object, you want to use quad source. Only remember that quad source takes a ref. So you have to execute the name first in the right namespace, of course. And finally, if it's a source that comes from a text file, then you would have to use this ibeam with a strange number to get that information and dig it out from there. Oh, right. And if you want to get the information about multiple things, not just a single one, then you would have to make some modifications because only the top three can take multiple names. So all of that and more goes into quad ATX. So quad AT was for attributes, and this is the extended attributes. Some of it is something you'll be able to see before. Let's say we create some source, and then we use quad fix on the source to create this function. Now you'll have noticed that I put in some spaces, and also I typed, instead of 1000, I wrote 1E3 with a lowercase 3. And you have probably experienced APL normalizing the source for you. If you ask for the nested representation and then mix it for display purposes, you'll see that APL normalized the source. And in fact, you can do this with quad ATX as well. And you might ask then, well, what am I gaining? Just note that quad ATX can return the source as you typed it, which is something that has been impossible until now. So if you're writing tools that deal with the source of various things, and you want to preserve the source as it was typed, this is the way to go. And you have the one-stop shop for all the information about something. And there are more details, quad ATX, as you probably guessed from these numbers, 61 and 60, a whole lot more options. And we are very likely to add more in the future. If there's something particular you'd like to see, you might want to let us know. Okay, the other utilities I'm going to deal with are utilities written in APL. The first one is Apple Cart. Now you might recognize this name. It is indeed very similar. It is, should we say, the API function or the backend for the Apple Cart user command. The difference between them is that if you give it a query, it will give you an actual matrix of expressions and their explanation rather than printing it out in a nice formatted form. So if you want to write your own interface for Apple Cart, this is the function you want to use. Same thing if you want to bundle it with something else, this is what you want to use. You can even get all the meta information that Apple Cart stores, which you cannot get with the user command. But because that's a large, very wide array, you might want to use the view user command as we're doing here. You can see all the columns, it tells you exactly what type of things there are and all the keywords, etc. Expand config. Let me give you a bit of background on that. We have now since 18.0, I think, had this utility function called config. It takes the name of a configuration parameter. What's a configuration parameter, you ask? Well, it could be an environment variable that's commonly used on Unix type systems. It can be a command line parameter. It can be a registry setting under Windows, or you can use one of these config files that we now use. to set these things. Either way, whatever way it's been set, you can get the configuration parameter using the config function. Now that's all very good. However, let's say you want to take multiple values from various configuration parameters and build up some kind of string from that. It can get a bit long and hard to read. You can, it works, right? But you might want to play some tricks with namespaces to try to shorten it down. It's not exactly pretty. You could try to use array comprehension type things. That just makes it out of reading order. Wouldn't it be nice if you could take a template message like here, and then kind of like a mail merge, replace everything that's in the square brackets with the corresponding value from the configuration parameter that is named in there. That is exactly what expand config is about. So you give it that template and it fills it all out, much like you would have in, say, a shell. Now here's a problem. What kind of syntax should we use? Salt has used these square brackets traditionally, but various popular environments use various patterns. And sometimes when there is adjacent text to the name of the configuration parameter, then you need to switch that up a bit, add some curly braces. Why not just take all? So expand config understands all of these and it will do the right thing. However, even there's an issue, because if you have some of these special characters, you would have to escape them. And each of these environments, in fact, use their own escaping mechanism, except Salt, which doesn't have any. And expand config understands all these escape characters as well from all your favorite environments. Of course, that leads us on to a third problem, which is, what if you want some of these escape characters, say a $sign or some or special characters, or you want a backtick or etc. And that, of course, we cannot know what it is you want. But what you can do is you can specify as left argument to expand config what type of syntax you want to use, and it understands all kinds of synonyms as well. So just write whatever you think is fitting, and it will figure it out. And in that case, it will limit itself to only the syntax of that system that you're naming on the left, and only the escape characters of that system that you're naming on the left. And finally, view. Yes, that is very much like the view user command. But if you want to use that in your own code to pop up a window to show something without it otherwise cluttering what it is you're doing, that's what you want. So this just takes any array and sticks it into a temporary window like that. You can use it to build a utility function. Here, for example, I'm combining the model implementation from the array notation with this view function. So this will give us like an array viewer, and we can then use that for an array, and we get a window, a temporary window popping up with the array notation for that array without otherwise cluttering or defining any variables. So I know this was a lot. This is the overview of it. Actually, this isn't even everything that's new in 18.2. There are also other enhancements to various utilities that existed before. Check those out in the release notes. And with that, I've got 3 minutes for questions, as I promised. Yes.
Oh, if you've read them, then you can carry on.
Yeah, I can see that Joao is asking the question as to why improve name, why not improve map instead of adding a new command. Well, we did consider improving existing user commands for listing names. However, all of them had various syntaxes that were conflicting with what we wanted to do in the names command. Map, in fact, doesn't list names in the same way that that names does at all. It draws kind of like a tree structure of the current namespace or specified namespace. So that wouldn't be the one, but there are other commands like names like in ms like and fns like and so on They were never geared for dealing with namespaces. And so that didn't fit in nicely in the syntax either. And those numbers for the various types as well. And some of those user commands were added for compatibility with the APL2. So we kind of want to leave those alone, not changing things. That's why we've added a new one, and it also has an easier to remember name. And what you want to find out is all the names of things.
Thank you. And one other point I think that you possibly mentioned, but it's might be worth clarifying, is that the idea with expand config, I guess, is that it helps you write cross-platform code that uses the configuration settings.
Yes, so the config function itself that I mentioned, it is cross-platform. So you can, it doesn't matter what you're running and how you're running it, it will pick up all these different types of settings. So that you could already do. Expand config, again, it allows you to write code in not just cross-platform, but also in whichever way you're most comfortable. So if you're used to some syntax, you can keep that and just tell it to use that syntax.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. There is less than 1 minute left. So Adám, unless you've got anything else you want to say, then I guess we draw stumps at that.